these things can't be controlled. People think they can control them, but you can't. And it quite quickly got out of control. And so it's long since left any science behind, even the mainstream science. The mainstream science does not say in any way, shape or form that there is going to be a global catastrophe. It just doesn't. IPCC, AR5, AR6, they just do not say that. So, but the culture has long since outgrown all science. It has no dependency on science now. It's just embedded in publics, embedded in authorities. It's captured the elites. So the scientific arguments are in a way fruitless or powerless to do anything about that. It's long since left the science behind. And indeed, scientists who quote the IPCC, a long time ago, it used to be people quoted the IPCC in favor of sort of what you might call a more alarmist view. But now it's got to the point where anybody quoting the IPCC is saying, well, it's not going to be a catastrophe. It's called a denier.
Hello, everyone. Anders here with Mind the Shift. As you know, we talk about the topic of climate sometimes, off and on this channel. There are quite a few political as well as economic and scientific, of course, aspects to that topic. But it turns out there's also a deeply cultural aspect, or is it perhaps even religious? I'd like to introduce you to my guest today, who is Andy West. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Fantastic, Anders. It's a privilege to be on.
You have written this book, an ambitious and detailed book called The Grip of Culture, and I've just read it.
Yeah.
And it has the properties of a proper scientific paper, really, although it is a proper book, of course.
Yes.
And it drills down into the depths of what you call, and I think many others also call, climate catastrophism, and what it's really based on.
Yes.
So let's just jump right into that and start there. What is climate catastrophism, and what makes climate catastrophism a culture rather than a scientifically rooted opinion or knowledge?
Okay. Well, what I mean by climate catastrophism is indeed a culture. A better way of thinking about it is a cultural entity. So if you like, it's self-bounded, it has its own characteristics. And cultural entities include, we have various words for them. So you might say religions, although they're typically the spiritual version of cultures. You might say ideologies. People tend to use that for political ones. Sometimes cults, or even strong philosophies. But they all share the same underlying behaviors. So even though they're very, very different, religious narratives are very different to, say, communist narratives, which are very different to fascist narratives, which are very different to climate catastrophe narratives. But the underlying behaviors are identical. And what I'm getting at is that you can actually measure these behaviors, because if there's enough social data, then you can measure that it is actually a cultural entity, which we can for climate catastrophism, because its whole history is on the internet. There's loads and loads of social data. So we can measure its signature and prove that it is one of these things. And where it comes from, effectively, it's a deep behavioral legacy from our evolutionary past. And the only purpose for these things is to glue large groups of people together, because large groups were the best way of surviving. But it comes from right back before even rationality had developed. So it developed in parallel with rationality. And if you want to glue millions and millions of people together, it's actually not good to use rationality, especially when there was very little of it around. It's actually better to bypass it and use emotion. So effectively, the team, the flag or the narrative, the religion, that is what glues people together in these very large groups. And for a very long time, that was an advantage.
Yeah, you say that a culture is always based on fairy tales, which may sound a bit
yes,
surprising. And you say that if it were to be based on truths, it wouldn't be a culture. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, it sounds very unintuitive, but if you think about it, if you think about its purpose is only to glue people together. The problem is, as rationality started to develop, especially if you want to glue 100 people together in a common action, especially in the face of knowing nothing about the world. And originally we had no science. We didn't really know anything about the world. Then if you try to glue them together with something vaguely rational, the problem is that everybody will have a different opinion on that rationality or a different angle. Effectively, it could be argued. People would take time to think about it rationally. It needs to be discussed, blah, blah. They won't just go and fight the enemy and cling to the flag and repel all borders, whether narratively or physically. And so the way to glue people together in a way that is unthinking, a way that they will stand up and fight for the group and demonize anybody who's not in the group, is effectively to use untruths. And the further away from reality, the better, because they can't be challenged. The only way to challenge them is to say, well, that's just bonkers. But in fact, that's a very easy argument for the culture to bring down, especially if authority is on its side, because the authorities just say, well, that's bonkers, and end of argument. So, in fact, the further distance from truth they are, the better they work.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
But I guess it makes sense when you think about it. So how did this particular culture start, and when did it start, as you see it?
Yes, when is a good question. These things are emergent, so they
gradual start, I guess.
Yes, it's a gradual thing. The beginning of it is that particular emotive narratives get transmitted more between humans depending on how much emotion they evoke. So you can effectively retransmit something. It's a bit like clicking on the internet. You click on it more if it's an emotive kind of meme or something like that. And before the internet was invented, then effectively humans do the same thing in their gossip, in their conversation. So whilst it was originally a scientific idea that there could be global warming, and indeed that humans were altering the climate in bad ways, because before the global warming there was global cooling.
Yeah.
And and so these memes, because they have no relationship to truth, only to emotion, and it's quite logical that, for instance, precursors to the global warming meme, like global cooling, which would seem to be the opposite, is in fact identical from a mimetic point of view. It's just like humans are bad, humans are altering the climate. And indeed, some people and some scientists, particularly Stephen Schneider being one, moved quite smoothly from pushing the global cooling to pushing the global warming. And culturally, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter. It's just an emotive meme that we're altering things in a bad way, and that's what gains traction. And I think it quite quickly. These things can't be controlled. People think they can control them, but you can't. And it quite quickly got out of control. And so it's long since left any science behind, even the mainstream science. The mainstream science does not say in any way, shape or form that there is going to be a global catastrophe. It just doesn't. IPCC, AR5, AR6, they just do not say that. So, but the culture has long since outgrown all science. It has no dependency on science now. It's just embedded in publics, embedded in authorities. It's captured the elites. So the scientific arguments are in a way fruitless or powerless to do anything about that. It's long since left the science behind. And indeed, scientists who quote the IPCC, a long time ago, it used to be people quoted the IPCC in favor of sort of what you might call a more alarmist view. But now it's got to the point where anybody quoting the IPCC is saying, well, it's not going to be a catastrophe. It's called a denier. Which happens to Judith Curry, happens to John Piker Jr. So
yeah, it's totally turned around.
Do
you think this has been orchestrated in any way, or is it organic? Or and when did it start? We didn't mention any years here, but maybe there was this film by Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth, 2006. Yes. Was that a pivotal point in this?
I think that was a pivotal point. I think it was already running by then, but I think that was a pivotal point where it really splurged onto the public first, and that's when around that time attitudes really began to spread much more throughout the public. And indeed, that's where I came to it. It's rather embarrassing from my point of view, because I counted myself quite knowledgeable about cultures, and I was looking around for a way to how you could measure them, how you could get more of a sort of quantitative grip on them rather than just, if you like, a qualitative grip. And I had no idea at the time that there was one developing as climate catastrophism, and I was absolutely, right under my nose. And it was only when I watched Al Gore's film I realized this is completely full of classic cultural memes. And I didn't know how much science there was as well. I have a degree in physics, so I knew all the terms they were talking about, but I didn't know how much science really was in there as well. But I thought, well, at minimum, even if there is some science, this is a completely cultural film. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I first started to research for what's behind it, and I quite quickly realized that it's left the science behind even then. Mm. And I think its roots clearly go back into the 80s and even the 70s with global cooling. And I think it started to maybe take a march on elites and governments after James Hansen's presentation in 1988, I think it was, where they turned the heating up in the meeting room to make people think that global heating was on the way. Mm. And but when it comes down to orchestration, it's a difficult thing. Quite a lot of climate skeptics, especially in America, have not been terribly comfortable with the fact that if you accept culture as the main causation, then it's not, the prime cause is not deliberate. It's emergent, and it's at all levels. It's of society, so not just the elites. It's got groundswell. It comes from everywhere, and although people are using their intelligence to promote it, cultural motives are upstream of intelligence. So the people who, and some people think, well, it's insulting my intelligence to say that I believe in this culture, but cultures, not only does it make no difference whether you're intelligent. There's been some work by Dan Carhan, the social psychologist, who says it's possible that the more intelligent you are, the more culturally
susceptible you are to.
Correct. And not only that, such people, because cultural belief is upstream of intelligence, some of his measurements show that the people who push it best are the people who have more intelligence and more knowledge, are more capable of pushing it. And those who are less cognitively capable and have less knowledge of the domain can't push it as well. But upstream of both those people, if you're culturally motivated, you can actually push it better. So I think it's very difficult to say, well, is it motivated in like a conspiracy, like a coordinated thing, or not? All I will say is that the cultures are easily, far and away, the best coordination mechanisms among humans. They can coordinate millions or even billions of people to actually, literally sing off the same hymn sheet, which is exactly where that phrase came from. It means the same culture. It means, we have the same cultural values. And, but it's also true that a lot of motivations for control and money can effectively surf on a culture. And they can become almost invulnerable by being in its mode. So, if you think of fascist Germany, on anti-Semitism, and science was supporting that as well through eugenics, which all turned out to be rubbish. And so it's very easy if you're riding, if you're I'll call it surfing, because you can't actually ride them in the sense you can't control them. It's controlling them, not the other way around. But it's also true that those kinds of agendas for money and power can be almost invulnerable if they're on a culture. But without the culture, they'd be very fragile. They would not be able to do the conquering the world that they do. So yes, there are agendas, but they're not the prime cause. The prime cause is the culture, and the agendas are effectively taking advantage of the culture.
Oh yeah. It's okay, I understand. Yeah, so if the leaders have been surprised at the emergence of this culture, and then, as you say, they might have, after a while, taken advantage of it and
yes.
seen that, oh, this is something we can utilize.
Exactly, and some of them are actual believers, some of them aren't. Some of them are more, shall we say, consciously writing, but quite a lot of them are themselves believers. But it's a lot easier to believe in something if it also suits your nefarious agenda, right? So there's a grey area there.
Okay, so you mentioned that you were a bit embarrassed yourself that you hadn't seen this emerging at some point there. But so tell us to back up a little bit. Tell us about what your background and how you ended up in this field and decided to dissect the phenomenon of climate catastrophes, because you're not a social scientist or a sociologist from the beginning. You're something different.
Yes, I had a degree in physics and had a career in the embedded electronics industry. So, but I have had a lifelong interest in what started out as kind of evolutionary studies, you might call it, and I guess right from teenage years, where did we come from? Who are we? And it started with the physics of where the universe came from, but then it was like much more interesting, I thought, to be where did humans come from? Where did life come from? So I was deeply into evolutionary studies, and first of all, biological evolution, but then more and more I got sucked over to the cultural evolution side, realizing that, evolution for humans is now a matter of what our brains do rather than what's happening with our bodies. And so, well, what do our brains do? And at first I kind of attacked it from the point of view, well, people are rational, and therefore, we need to rationally think what is the best thing to evolve to next, say, for instance. But it doesn't work like that. And it turns out that a great deal of people aren't rational. I mean, by a great deal, I mean a great deal of all of us. So
Yeah.
a lot of our brains
is
aren't.
anybody totally rational? Is it even possible to be that? And is it even
Exactly.
something you should strive for? I don't know.
Yes, it might not be very nice because effectively you'd be Vulcans, but there would be no there'd be no team spirit. The kind of leadership that you get, these charismatic leaders leading companies like Apple or whatever, or Elon Musk and SpaceX, which my company used to deliver computers to, in fact. That would go as well in a sense, because the reason that people follow them is partly cultural. And without those things, so there would be no nationalism, and there would be, and religion, despite they've done a lot of harms, a lot of good work is done in religious terms as well. I mean, there probably wouldn't be civilization without religion, because the first civilizations, to build the cities in Ur, to build the water structures there, it was counted as a religious duty, and without that duty, there would probably be no civilization. So it's very hard to see how you can do without it. But at the same time, it can have a real problem. So I was getting more and more to thinking about that, and eventually it wasn't even the evolution of these things. It was more a point. Well, how do they work now? Never mind how we got here. How do they just work? How do they influence people? And that is how I came. And just at the time Al Gore's film came out, I was thinking to myself, well, okay, I'm finding out a lot just by reading and digging, but I lacked a quantitative angle. I couldn't measure anything, and I thought, well, I don't have a university department or whatever. I probably never could measure anything. First of all, I saw Al Gore's films. I thought, well, at least there's a culture here that's on the internet. It's almost completely grown on the internet. So that was a big stage for me, as well as being a big stage for the world, because that's when it really started to take off.
Okay. So you have found that, and you talk about religion here and how civilization started with people gathering around religions, and I agree. Personally, I have ideas about whether religion is spiritual or not, but it doesn't matter. It's not that kind of conversation now, perhaps, but religions are cultural. I totally acknowledge that, of course. And you found these correlations between and alliances between religiosity and climate catastrophism, which are very fascinating. And I think that's a bit groundbreaking, as far as I can understand, the findings that you have done there. And so how do they look, these alliances, these correlations between religiosity in different countries and this climate catastrophism culture?
Well, first of all, yes, it is groundbreaking, because there is a very large and long founded academic discipline which is geared up to finding social predictors for attitudes to climate change, and their original thought was to find one, whether it's politics, does that predict it, or your age, or your sex, or whatever, or your educational attainment, or at a national level, nations that are more threatened by climate change, maybe, or whatever. And they fail to find a good predictor. I mean, they're predicted in the sort of 5 to 10% region, if you like. And that area of academia got more and more complex over the years. It's like 15, 20 years old, and they got more and more complex statistics and more complex models. And they've completely missed the fact there's a very simple single predictor that works for all the world except America, because America is a bit more complicated. Same principles apply there, but it's more complex. But everywhere else, you only need one predictor to get stunning predictions of attitudes to climate change, and that's because religion and climate catastrophism have a relationship. And so if you use national religiosity, it has to be at the national level. You can't do it at the individual level. You've got to do it at in national buckets, because religion is a group phenomenon anyway, and that's the way to do it. And the relationships are stunning. There's quite a lot of attitudes to climate change. You can get an 80% predictor or 70%. This is amazing for social psychology. But anyway, but the relationship it's not intuitive. It's a dual relationship. So saying things like, well, do you believe the nations that are much more religious believe more in climate change or less? Then it's not as simple as that. What actually occurs is that there are two scenarios, which are unconstrained scenarios and reality constrained scenarios. So if you ask an unconstrained, so it's an open-ended.
Explain unconstrained in this context.
Yes, probably best to explain reality constrained first, and then reality constrained is where you ask a question, but there's a constraint on it. Like, for instance, which one out of these 10 priorities would you think is most important? So the constraint is the other 9, effectively, because you've got to think about how you're going to say, if one of the priorities is climate change, how would you rank climate change? It means you have to think about all the other things. That's a reality constraint. Or how much you're going to pay for this policy, something like that. An unconstrained one is where you don't have any of that limitation. It might just be how serious do you think climate change is? So you don't have to refer to anything else. You don't have to refer to any other priorities like education or terrorism or anything like that. You don't have to refer to amounts of money. You're really just appealing to people's what effectively amounts to, for a cultural subject, you're appealing to their emotion. So people who think climate change is really, really bad, it's always terrible, it's really serious. And that turns out to be an emotive reaction that reveals a cultural thing, a cultural motivation, shall we say. So what the relationship is, that for unconstrained scenarios, then the more religious the nation, the more there will be attitudes that are supportive of climate change. So, and it's a really steep graph, so for secular countries like, say, Sweden or Denmark, which are, around the lowest, only about 1 in 5 people are religious in those kind of nations. Then, if you say, well, the number of people who might say, if your options to how serious is climate change are something like, serious, extremely serious, not very serious, then only about 10% of the population in those nations will say it's extremely serious. But if you go right to the other end of the scale and have very religious nations like, Thailand, Pakistan, India, which are, effectively 100% religious, or, near as damn it, then, and you ask the same question, then the number of people who will put extremely serious is kind of over 60%. So there's a huge difference between 10% and 60% answer. So a very steep graph across nations. But if you ask a reality constrained question, then it's more or less the opposite. Mm-hmm. Then the people in the very religious countries will their support for climate change collapses effectively, and they give it a very low priority. They don't think they should.
Then it gets down to hands-on, concrete questions about.
Yes, like, would you give it any money, or would you prioritize it against, education or whatever other things? And the reason it collapses is that they're fundamentally, they fall back to religion when so it's their religious values that really tell them how they would prioritize things in the world, and so it collapses. So that 60-odd% for an unconstrained question collapses to down, maybe 10-15% for a reality constrained question. But in the secular nations, it's the opposite, effectively. So the very small percentages of people who would answer it's extremely serious, but they will actually support it more in terms of priorities, because they're treating it not less emotively, and so they treat it as a sort of effectively a scientific reality, because and the default for science is to support it, so they'll give it space. I mean, still not huge space. You know, as you know, there's a lot of resistance to heat pumps and things instead of gas boilers even in the West. But their support is far higher than in religious nations because it's treated as a sort of scientific subject and less emotively. So the weird thing is, you get these, you get a complete crisscross of across the religiosity axis as to depending on whether you're in a reality constrained or an unconstrained. And this is exactly what you would expect from cultures interacting. What's happening is all the religious leaders have signed, official statements saying, we support climate change, blah 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 blah, and so all their flocks are comfortable with catastrophe narrative. It's very similar to religion. There's a doomsday, there's judgment day, but there's also salvation. And for climate catastrophism, a crash net zero program is its salvation narrative. So the religious people are very comfortable at that level, and that's why they poll really high values for unconstrained, stuff. Yeah, we think it's really serious. The Pope thinks it's serious, so we think it's serious. The high Anglican guys think it's serious, so their flock thinks it's serious. Same it's identical across any faith. So it's Judaism, Hinduism, doesn't make any difference. They're all identical in their reactions to climate catastrophe.
But then when it comes to what to do about it, concretely, then it's a different story.
Collapse. Yes, and in secular nations it's the opposite way around. So, but and it's because also in the secular nations they don't have a religion to defend. They're largely irreligious. So there's not this huge, difference between the difference is the other way around, but it's smaller.
One might perhaps think that those kinds that are irreligious or not. I mean, that are secular, that they kind of exchange, replace that non-religious reality with this new culture. I mean,
yes.
Point out in the book the area in the world, the region in the world which is most secularized, I think, Western Europe, is probably the region where this climate catastrophism is most is the biggest and the most pronounced. So that might not be a coincidence. What do you think about that?
No, it's not. It's not a coincidence. And if you, for instance, as you've seen in the book, if you plot climate activism, like the number of groups for Extinction Rebellion or climate rights for children, they are again a very steep graph, or very high in secular nations and very low in religious nations. And this tells us that the people who actually believe it are much stronger in the secular nations. But the other thing it tells us, which is less intuitive and less well understood, is that in fact the reason that these groups are so aggressively active, if you might, like taking action like Extinction Rebellion does, stopping roads, gluing themselves to things, whatever, is because in the secular nations, whilst the belief in climate catastrophism is more there, it's actually still a huge minority of the population who really ardently believe it, and because the Western nations don't have this big emotive belief that gets these 60% that you do in the religious ones, then the activists, there's actually more of them, but they perceive that society isn't listening to them because there isn't these huge figures of people saying it's really serious, extreme. The people who think it's extremely serious are very small. So you've got far less people saying it's extremely serious and more activists who actually believe it. And those activists want to move this big society. They perceive they're vastly outnumbered, and they're active to try and move society in their direction. But in the religious nations, it's kind of the opposite. For a start, it's not perceived that there's a need to move society because all the religious people say, yeah, it's extremely serious. So activists there don't think they have anything to fight. But when it actually comes down to reality anyway, there's less activists there, and nobody wants to fight it because they're back down to religious values. Yeah. So it's very unintuitive, this. But the reason that the groups are so active in Western nations is not because they're a huge grassroots majority. It's because although there are more believers there, they're still a tiny minority. And what they're trying to do is persuade the whole Western populations, who really aren't. They're less as a sort of bulk of the population. They're much less emotively engaged. And so the fact that there's very low numbers who say it's extremely serious is what really riles the activists up, and that's what they want to fight against. But in religious nations, 2/3 of the nation thinks it is extremely serious. So there's no need to rail against it.
Yeah,
it's very unintuitive, but the graphs are really, really clear.
But it's fascinating. So your book comes with something, a new insight here. That, I mean, you're not the only one saying that climate catastrophism is a new sect or a new religion or so. But you're saying that it's actually not a proper religion. It's not spiritual or anything. It's just it's a culture, and you haven't seen that because you haven't seen these connections between religiosity and climate.
Yes. You need to look at these connections between religiosity and climate catastrophism, which there are loads and loads and loads, because the world is surveyed. Countries are surveyed all the time about their attitudes to climate change. So there's tons of data, and it's all publicly available. All you have to do is type a bunch of numbers for religiosity and a bunch of numbers for climate attitudes into Excel, push the button, and out come these amazing correlations.
Yeah.
So yes. But you're right. It's not a spiritual religion. That the best way to look at it is that religions, cults, ideologies, they're all driven by these evolutionary behaviors underneath, and it's arbitrary what the narratives are. People tend to think, well, if it's even a secular religion, shouldn't it have a supreme being or prayers or whatever? No. The narratives are arbitrary. Communism didn't necessarily have a supreme being when it started. You could argue that Stalin or whoever became one as a personality cult, but it doesn't literally have a god. Neither does fascism, and neither does climate catastrophism. But they do have, people dress up in silly robes like religion quite often, like Extinction Rebellion. They do have prophets like Gore,
like Greta Thunberg and
Greta Thunberg. And in fact, all cultures do target children, because children are geared to essentially swallow a cultural template whole. It's meant to be their native one. It's meant to be, but effectively, if you steal them at the school level, if you infiltrate schools, then you can effectively grab them and put them on your side. So that's why not just climate catastrophism is all over the schools, but other secular cultures now, like extreme trans rights, which is just another cultural entity, I think. Unfortunately, not enough data to prove it in that case, I think, but it looks like one.
Maybe
and so
from you.
Sorry?
Maybe next book.
Maybe next book, yeah. And also the one based on the so-called anti-racism one based on critical rights theory. That is one too. And these things, they attack the schools because you can capture the children, and it works very easily. Yeah,
fascinating. When you spoke about this, the situation in the West, in Western Europe, where the activists are actually a tiny minority, as you say, but they are fighting very fiercely, much more so than in these religious countries, because they realize that they are a minority, and they have this righteous fight for a better society.
Correct.
And that reminds me of Francis Fukuyama. You're familiar with Francis Fukuyama, of course, this social scientist. Political scientist, rather, who wrote this book in the early 90s called The End of History and the Last Man.
And I haven't read the book, but yes, I'm aware.
And it's been criticized, not least by himself, actually. I think a bit unfairly so. But anyway, I understand that not everything he wrote in 1991 could be still be true. But anyway, in the last part of that book, The Last Man, it's called The Last Man. I think it's the last 2 or 3 chapters or something. A long time since I read it. But that is about, and it's under analyzed, I think, that part of it, because that is about when there are no more fights for the big societal change, the communism, socialism, liberalism, all these isms, when that's no longer happening, and societies are fairly, people aren't dirt poor anymore, so they lead good lives. So what's the point? What's the meaning of living our lives now? We need some meaning, and he said that there is a risk or a possibility that many people in these countries who end up in this situation will try to find something worthy to fight for, or perceived injustice or oppressor to fight against.
Yes.
To find meaning in life. What do you think of that explanation?
I've got a lot of time for that approach. I think you can some people these days call it. I don't think you use that term, but nowadays you call it a luxury belief to some extent. Because there's only societies that are rich enough and well off enough to have these kind of beliefs. But I will also say, it's not. it's less logical than that in the sense that these belief systems, these behaviors that lead to these belief systems are very, very much ingrained in us, and it's kind of less a case that you've run out of beliefs, so you have to invent one. It's the case that we're always going to do this automatically, whether we're in a rich or a poor nation, because it's too deeply ingrained in us. We're slowly evolving away from it. But we probably had these beliefs first laid down, long before we were even Homo sapiens sapien. Certainly evidence of religious behavior in Neanderthals and earlier. And in terms of body language and other social glue, it may go back to apes. So these things, and there's probably been thousands and thousands of religions. It's just that they're all forgotten, and the few that made it to the modern era are still around. So I think I think humanity is going to do this, however much money or comfort they have, or don't have. That might affect the nature of the culture, but they're still going to do it. And so as religion declined, I think certainly that's given an opportunity for other secular cultures to sprout up, if you like. And but it doesn't mean that they will always win or that they're always bad. I think but I think you have to look at it from a group perspective. You can't just say as individuals what you think about that. Are you going to support this culture or not? Cultures are group phenomena, and they are being fought at a group level by what I call rationality at scale. So things like democracy, science, the law. These are a way to try and get rationality to operate at the same scale as cultures do. And it's far more complicated. Cultures just do it like that. It's instinctive. We just do it. But these systems require massive sets of rules to coordinate, to try and keep culture and bias out. In fact, and maintain a logical approach across society. And all the time, cultures are undermining them, attacking them, whilst at the same time, rationality at scale is limiting and bounding cultures. So it's like a forever war. But I think slowly, you can sort of maybe save the best bits of culture, the bits you need, like team spirit and some nationalism, maybe whatever. You need an urge to go to the stars. That might have to be cultural. But at the same time, hopefully, rationality at scale will grow enough to stop these things really taking off in negative directions, which is happening with climate catastrophism, because it's got some disastrous policies, and they're not even going to help with there's a real climate problem somewhere far distance from all this culture. But what's happening with the solutions and everybody thinking about it has nothing to do with that. It's all to do with cultural goals and with salvation. And the solutions are going to be a much bigger problem than the problem.
And nobody's going to know changes of energy systems and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think it will be many, many generations before we've bounded cultures more. Where we currently are, I can't remember who quoted this. It was somebody Roman, but even by our own measurements, we're only half men. We're not the sentient individual in control people you kind of like to think. We're very subject to groupthink, and that groupthink frequently gets out of control. And the thing is, to go back a little bit to is it orchestrated by nefarious agendas or not? The thing is, the lessons, even from the Second World War and Nazism, are that it can happen to anybody, and a whole population will turn. And it happens at all levels of society. The fact that certain elites take it to their advantage or push agendas they may already have, they wouldn't be able to do that without the culture as a vehicle to do it in.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask about that, and you touched on it here now, this orchestration thing, because here's another hypothesis. Let's hear what you think about that. I mean, a crisis that can keep the citizens of a country in fear is ideal for the powers that be, because it's easier to control people that are scared than people who are happy and content and all that, and feel that they are in their own power. And the climate crisis is even more perfect than other crises, I think, because it has so long lead times, and as soon as no other crisis is at hand, like the migration crisis, a pandemic, a financial crisis, then you could always, there's always the good old looming climate catastrophe to, to put out there, to put forward and keep people at bay with. So what do you think of that hypothesis?
I think
useful crisis for leaders.
Yeah, I think, I think it's not exactly wrong, but I think it's not exactly right. It's the problem is it tends to encourage a sort of view that, especially if you look at the history of the Club of Rome, and you follow the WEF up through it tends to encourage a sort of James Bond villain type view of the situation.
Yeah, or maybe they have taken advantage of it gradually after having seen that this could be useful or something like that.
Yes, I think that's a better frame. The people who first started articulating these things and how they want to stop population growth, for instance, were already infected by memes, Malthusian memes and the early climate stuff about cooling and so on and so forth. So how much were they trying to be in control, and how much were the memes in control of them? Because the things they went to those first early starters of climate catastrophism, and it's now blossomed into pandemic stuff and so on. The memes were in charge of them at least as much as they were in charge of the memes. And so, who is the boss, them or the memes? But I think that a useful line to draw is that even if the framework is and the primary causation is cultural, we don't usually let people off the hook if they've done bad things in the name of a culture. So even if they're like they kind of believe it, or even they've persuaded themselves to believe it because it happens to suit their agenda. It's very easy to believe something if you make a lot of money and power out of it. But it still might have triggered emotive behaviors in those people as well. But a great line to draw is, well, if those people are doing bad things in the name of the culture, we don't really care that how much they were motivated by the culture and how much they were motivated by nefarious. We should still prosecute them to the maximum extent of rationality at scale, science and the law, for anything they've done that is wrong. And we don't, for instance, war criminals. Quite a lot of war criminals, were clearly motivated by, way out there cultures, nationalism, fascism, whatever. But the fact that they were so motivated doesn't make us let them off. It's clear from some of them, like the war trials of the Second World War. It's clear some of them are still drinking the Kool-Aid. Even at that point, they still believed in the culture, and I think that we don't let those people off, and so we should operate the same rule. We don't really care that they're culturally motivated.
But there are some cases now in the justice system in this country, and I think also in England and some other places, that there is clemency. I think you write about this in the book as well. People who have committed crimes. I mean, not heinous crimes, but could be like throwing paint on a valuable painting or something.
Yes,
and they are sentenced in a very lenient way, and there is clemency because they did it for a good cause. So this is actually happening.
Exactly, it is exactly happening, and that's how that's how the law is undermined, the institutions are undermined. They're all pushed towards the culture. So the culture, A, tries not to prosecute them. B, if it has to, because the law is still managing to hold some ground against the culture, they're prosecuted very lightly. They're let off. In some cases they might do things wrong, and they get let off completely. And not only that, sometimes it's even seen as a badge of honor, culturally speaking, that they broke the law, because they broke the law, for what at the time is considered to be, history will approve of this. Well, history very much won't approve of it, in truth.
Well, in some cases, it might be a good thing to break the law if the law is bad. I mean, if
yes, I mean,
Nazi Germany, you might be.
Well, you could say the suffragettes. This is a great case.
That's a good case.
But but the problem is that we have to distinguish between what are genuine causes, which are not primarily culturally driven, and ones which are. And there's some tests you can run, even without measuring stuff. You can just run logical tests. So, for instance, in my book, where it compares the Children's Crusade in Alabama with the Children's Strikes for Climate. Which one is cultural and which one is not, and how do you ask the questions to tick the boxes? Are they sponsored by a culture? Well, for the Alabama one was, because it was actually sponsored by a religion. But was it promoting a religious narrative as its cause? Answer no. And in the climate case, answer yes, because climate catastrophism is absolutely a secular religious narrative.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the United States, because you've already mentioned that it's a special case in this context. Why is it a special case? What's happening?
It's special only because it has a political polarization that goes through the whole population that's really severe. There are other countries which I thought might fall out of the data as well, like Australia or Canada, where it's starting to get. But at the moment they don't. They stay within the rest of the world category, and they obey the rules of religiosity and climate catastrophism just like any other nation. So I thought that would be a problem, but it isn't. So the only nation that doesn't follow the simple rules of just testing two cultures, religion and climate catastrophism, is the US, and effectively it's because there are four. So there is the same two, religion and climate catastrophism, but there is also effectively Dem-Lib tribalism and Rep-Con tribalism. So the problem is you've actually got four cultures, and that's a bit more complicated. And so I devote a chapter, as you know, in the book to the US. And the weird thing is that religion, the belief in religion is for the Rep-Con tribe, effectively their belief in religion helps, because they're already skeptical for political reasons. Then their religious beliefs make them even more skeptical. So effectively, they're reduced even more on their belief in climate change. But it's the opposite for the Dem-Libs. In fact, because they're politically for climate catastrophism, their religion actually amplifies, because for unconstrained scenarios, religion and climate catastrophism are allied. Then effectively it doubles up. They're unconstrained, so their unconstrained measurements double up, and the Rep-Con ones drop even more, because their religious belief is because their innate skepticism is already turned on, is a good way of putting it. So it remains turned on for the religious peoples. It turns on even harder, and it's the opposite for the. So it's much more complicated. You've got to map these four cultures, which is what it comes down to.
And sadly, they're even more detached from science than in other parts of the world, as far as I can see. Because, I mean, Democrats believe in this catastrophism because Republicans don't, and vice versa. And that has nothing to do with science at all.
Nothing to do with the science at all. And you're right, this is the worst instance. It's the sort of worst case scenario. Everybody is behaving culturally. Whichever side you're on. The truth is that the Rep-Con tribe aren't they happen to be on the right side of being against the culture, but it's not for the right reasons. They're doing it for similar cultural reasons, and so everybody's behaving culturally, and nobody effectively the evidence is lost. The bit about where rationality at scale is trying to get a voice in this huge battle, a clash of cultural titans, is effectively they don't. You hear occasionally the voice of sanity, like Judith Curry, for instance, or Steve Kooning, but it's a tiny voice in the wilderness. And even most of the people, on the battling against it side are behaving culturally, and they use their old style cultural weapons in this war. They don't use science. They just beat up the other side. So worst case scenario. Really.
Worst case scenario. What if? How about science itself? I mean, if science were to be also considered culture, that would be a shocker for many, perhaps. But maybe what is often referred to as scientism is a culture. The belief that everything science says is set in stone, and you can't question it.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a culture yet, in the sense that it hasn't. It's not a boundable entity you can sort of grasp in your hand and say these are the rules for it. These are the dress codes. These are the narratives. But there is definitely some cultural behavior is science. I mean, its whole architecture these days with Nobel prizes and all sorts of grant funding and so on, and it's become the voice of authority, which has got unfortunately more and more abused, in adverts or anything, and indeed by cultural support, which may or may not be on the right side, but it's for the wrong reasons. So I think I deal with this, I think, in chapter 7. But the authority of science itself has developed its own cultural overhead, you might call it. It's not entirely lost yet. It's not become, we don't have the high priest of science yet. But it's why a lot of it has gone off course. People are treating scientists way too religiously. They believe their words far too often. And it's only slowly that the general public, I think, if there's one good thing that came out of the COVID thing, is that general publics have realised that scientists may not be as authoritative and right as they thought before, and that's probably a good thing, because science needs a big reset back to shedding its cultural values, I think, because that's what the social sciences particularly are just completely lost, as Heterodox Academy and others have shown with papers, it's clear and obvious that most of the social sciences is hijacked by, especially in the US, by one political view, which means you can't do proper social science because you haven't got a diversity of views, and it's going to lead to bias everywhere, and it has led to bias everywhere. So I think culture and science are mixed up, and that mixing has gone for a long way. So sometimes people reject a correct scientific consensus because it's actually presented as part of a culture. So, for instance, pretty decent medical science was tried to be exported to Africa or whatever in the 19th century, but because it came in a culture that was Bible bashing and with missionaries and all this, that, and the other, who were effectively the leading edge of then a lot of it was rejected, even though it's correct science. This is a kind of obvious example. The medicine was rejected because it came with a clearly cultural package, and the natives instinctively realized this was true. And that can happen in the modern world. Correct science can be rejected because it comes in a cultural package. They are mixed up. I wouldn't say it's got as far as science has not been completely hollowed out. It isn't yet a religion, but it's got way too much cultural overhead that really needs shedding.
Well, I guess proper science, science per se, cannot be a culture by definition. It's something different. It should be something different. But as you say here and point out, it can be kind of infected by cultural.
Exactly, infected is a good word. I mean, the problem is, you're right. By definition, it isn't a culture. But unfortunately, it's conducted by humans, and humans are very open to cultural behaviors. That's the problem. If it was carried out by robots only.
That's another discussion. Yeah,
it's another discussion.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So, to what extent have you yourself studied the topic itself? I mean, climate change and what's happening with the climate. And if so, could your findings have influenced your conclusions about, that climate catastrophism is a culture?
Well, nobody's without influence. But I came to this. I didn't come from this having any interest in climate or climate science at all. Up until Al Gore's film, I'd kind of registered that it was happening. You didn't have an opinion of your own at that time?
Not
a strong one. I generally thought it must all be true because I have a degree in physics. I'm into science. I had a scientific job, or technology job at least. I didn't particularly think to question it. I did sort of think, well, they're doing it. It's a bit of exaggeration here, but I didn't really question it. It just wasn't central in my life, to be honest. And even though I saw it on the news and so on and so forth, I generally thought, well, it's probably true. We probably need to do something, but carried on with life. It didn't really impact me. But really, the turning point was seeing Al Gore's film, and just that was a staggering realization that this blooming massive culture. It'd probably been bubbling away under my feet without me even noticing it. It was just, and so I did have a turning point there. And at that point, I did, I mean, I'm applying social psychology principles, and particularly Dan Carlin's cultural cognition is kind of what you could call my approach, and it's a very hands-on measuring data approach. But you're right, to be able to do that, you need to know the furniture of a domain. One of the things holding me back from measuring previous cultures, like I'm just not an expert at communism or fascism, and they're very regional, not global, like climate catastrophism. And B, they're so far back in history with their glory days, were in the 1930s, 40s, 50s for communism and so on. It's so far back. It's got so much historical baggage. You have to decipher that the people who were writing about it were themselves biased. It's not, most of it's not on the internet. I thought, there's no way I'm just not an expert enough. But for that, when I realized that climate catastrophism looked the hell like it's a culture, I thought, well, I don't, all the data is here. All the opinions are on the internet. They're all recorded. They're happening in real time. I can capture them. And so, I thought, well, there is a chance of measuring this one. But you need to know the furniture. If I'd attempted to measure communism, I'd need to know all the books about communism. I need to know its narratives. I would need to know how it progressed in various countries, what its historics are, effectively. Not just in Russia, but in China and Eastern Europe, wherever. And and that's why I was a bit depressed. I thought, well, it'd take me like three careers to measure that.
Yeah.
But for climate change, I spent some years. Whilst I was thinking about my cultural stuff, I did, hang out on various blogs, what's up with that, and on the Real Climate for the orthodox side, and read them quite often, and a range of other blogs, obviously Judith Curry's eventually. And my goal wasn't to come to a conclusion about, well, who is right? Is it the the people who are really say we're destined for something bad, the people who very skeptical and say, well, really it's nothing to worry about hardly at all, and or the lukewarmers in between or whatever. My goal wasn't to end up at one of those points. My goal was only to understand the furniture enough so that I knew what was happening, what the main arguments are, on whether, therefore, are they culturally driven or not. And so I don't really have an opinion about the physical science, and in a way, it's better not to have one. If you want to, for me, if you want to measure a domain, the social psychology of a domain, it's actually best not to know what it's about. If you went to sort of a native tribe in South America, and they had these strange cultures, and it was, I don't know, about worshipping some tree and then drinking its sap or something. See, it's probably better not to know whether the sap's good for them or not, or whether it's medical. It's better first to measure what's going on culturally, because you aren't biased then to what may or may not, whether the reviews have any reality or not. And so I've deliberately not tried to form any conclusions about the physical science, and as you know, the gold standard for the book, which you have to take something for in referencing, stuff, is actually the IPCC, and its working group outputs, which I think, despite perhaps massive groupthink in the IPCC, which Judith Curry points to, I can quite happily take that as my gold standard, because the truth is the culture completely ignores that standard anyway. It's completely in contradiction to it. Yeah. So it kind of doesn't matter, because, and I think we probably lose a lot of effort, and it's spent. We should pursue the physical science, but I think there's such a lot of effort spent in passionate argument about technical details, and those on the skeptical side think they'll win if they could only win the scientific case. Well, no, it's ceased to have anything to do with science a very long time ago, and that the entire stuff that's running in the world, also all the policy, you can actually measure the deployment of renewables. It follows a clearly cultural pattern, which means it doesn't depend on the climates of the nations, the climate exposure of the nations, any science or technology factors, or even rationality. It is a cultural pattern, and therefore the culture is dictating what's happening. It measurably dictates policy, and it measurably dictates attitudes, whether people are for it or against it. So it's running the whole show. Science is nowhere. So there's no, I mean, we should still pursue the physical science, right? It's noble. We need to pursue it. But I suspect it'll be a long time before people are bottomed out. Meanwhile, if we want to stop, ludicrous net zero policies that are doing great harm, then science is not, forget it. It's a cultural thing you have to understand.
Yeah, I've been pondering a lot how this is going to play out, and if it's going to end, and if it's just going to peter out, and people are going to talk about other things, and nobody will really remember what was being said about this. But what do you think about this climate catastrophism culture? Is it eventually going to come to an end? And if so, what will precipitate its fall? Would it be an ever more apparent non-apocalypse, or would it be something else?
That's a great question. I don't think I know the answer to that question. I have some thoughts, which is not the same as an answer. But I do know that cultural entities, once they've built up a huge amount of inertia in terms of belief with millions of people, in terms of they're effectively orientating organizations and finance and structures to them. So there's rafts and rafts of charities and NGOs and the UN and government policy, and so it's got itself completely embedded in what you might call the sort of real working world of humans. It's in all their institutions, it's in all their policies, it's in the heads of millions of people. That is not going to go away quickly. There's just way too much inertia, and as we know from the big mainstream religions like Christianity or Islam, they're clocking up a couple of millennia, right? And they're still they're still pretty big. There's actually still
alive and kicking. Well, not kicking perhaps, but still there.
Yes, and in the case of some kicking, I think we could say that Islam is kicking at the moment.
Yeah, that's true.
And the truth is, there is way more people in the world that actually formally believe in religion than don't. And even of the ones who don't, about half of them have some thought that there is spirituality. So they're not completely in the arms of a religion, but they still think they have kind of religiously orientated views, if you like. And even the formal belief is still a majority, like 60-65% or whatever of the world. So they are more than alive and kicking. Yeah, they're still really.
But this is something a little bit different. Maybe it will morph into something different. I mean, if science comes to the conclusion gradually, the coming decades, that maybe it wasn't that dangerous, and it doesn't seem to happen that much. Then it will still be there, but will be called something different. I recall writing about a UN organ that was created in the late 1970s about desertification of the world, because that was a big issue back then. The deserts are growing, and they were growing for a couple of decades because of a drought. It was a prolonged drought, but it ended 1985 or so, and now there's greening.
Yes, because more CO2.
The deserts are shrinking, but that organization within the UN system is still there. But they have changed their, the narrative of why they're there and what they're doing. They're now working against general, degradation of land. I mean, they could have done that from the beginning, but it was specifically for desertification. But that wasn't a problem. What to do now? We can't just scrap the organ.
Yeah, we don't want to. We don't give up our jobs. Yeah, no. We're not going to do that. Clearly.
So maybe it's going to be something similar here. This whole culture will be morphing into something else.
I think that is definitely the kind of course. There's vast inertia behind this thing. It's not just going to stop. Cultures very rarely just collapse or brought to a shuddering halt. Okay, in Central Europe, fascism was brought. It was a culture made of about 1/3 National Socialism, 1/3 anti-Semitism, and 1/3 eugenics, which was its scientific support. And that combination was pretty toxic and had a terrible culture in so it was eventually brought to a shuddering halt, but only by a huge war. And it's very rare that cultures, I think, are brought down in that way. And even then, little threads of it survived. for decades, and even now, some people still believe in it. But it was effectively more or less brought down in that way. But I don't think there could be, a war in the case of it's embedded in every, it would be a civil war in every country, and that's not going to happen. But at the same time, yes, it's evolving all the time. It never stops. And that's the curious thing, because people who believe in it always think that the views are rock solid and unchangeable. But in fact, the narrative moves them on and moves them on. That's how it became climate change from global warming, because climate change is a much more useful phrase because you can apply it to everything. Global warming's got much more narrow scope. Really, climate change will effectively allows you to say anything is a problem caused by climate change, even cold weather. So that's an evolution, and the hockey stick, which was once a very important cultural symbol, got de-emphasized because it got too close to reality, in the sense that the people with actual science were starting to point out, like in the hockey stick illusion, and Andrew Montford pointed out flaws in its scientific approach, and it was getting too dangerous in their reality that somebody might bring it down. As I said at the beginning, all the cultural ideas have to be as distant from reality as possible, and that was too close to criticism. And so the hockey stick has been de-emphasized. It's now not an important part of the culture anymore. It's still referred to, but it's like, this is only a 10-year period, yet people still think that everything's the same as it was, but it's not.
No.
Of course, it's evolved.
No.
And, if you look at Christianity over, if you sampled it every 2 centuries, the people that you sample in one set of 2 centuries, they will be amazed by what it was like 2 centuries before or 2 centuries before that. It continuously moves.
Yeah.
For instance, women were a huge part of early Christianity, but they were written out of the story when they weren't needed anymore. And the culture was big enough to kind of become a patriarchy, didn't need them anymore. But it was super important at the beginning, because when it was being done in secret in Roman households, it was the women of the household who gave them the secret cellar or the basement and organized people to come around. They were a big part of it spreading. But when it didn't need them anymore, it kind of wrote them out. And so, and I think climate catastrophism will do all those kinds of things. It will evolve, but who knows to what? It's already started. It's already got tendrils all over. I mean, there's lots of messaging now coming from the World Health Organization that world health is climate health kind of angle. It's already the thing about cultures is because they aren't nefariously from a single direction, even though it often seems so, because everything's scripted, but it's scripted because it's an unconscious scripting. Everybody gravitates everywhere to the same thing. And so it's way better than a consciously organized nefarianism, because it's much better at coordinating. It can court 1 billion people easily, which you can't do with a nefarious agenda. But so it simultaneously explores every possible angle. And what actually happens is the successful ones get selected, and the people who are pushing them rise with that success. And the ones that aren't successful, and so another thing that's unintuitive, if it's going to back 1,000 of these horses, 300 of those horses may be direct contradiction to each other. This is not a problem for a culture. I mean, everything it says is hypocritical anyway. It has to be as false as possible. It is absolutely not a problem to back a bunch of horses who completely contradict and just see who wins. And effectively, that's how the things morph. And so, I think it's going to be into health. It's going to be into it's obviously
it is already, as you pointed out.
Yes. Yeah, and for a long time it's been into a much more sustainability kind of concept. So even if there wasn't climate change, you could say, well, yeah, but we still need to make everything sustainable. It's become
a psychological and cognitive paradigm.
Yes,
for the whole world, especially the Western world. But
yes,
really.
But for sure, it isn't just going to collapse.
No. So, what are your personal goals and hopes with the book and the findings of your book?
Well,
what do you hope to achieve?
What I would like to achieve is to get people first to understand that the culture is in charge, not the science, and all the both intuitive and unintuitive things that flow from that. There are some intuitive ones. Quite a lot of people have cottoned on that. How can Greta Thunberg's movement or XR and their red robes be anything other than culture. So a lot of people say it's beginning to instinctively say it's cultural, but but the problem is it's an opinion, so the culture can easily mow that down. But if we have a formal proof, as in my book, that it's a culture, we can formally prove it. It's got a cultural signal, just like religion has. Religion has a similar signature, which is in the book, in chapter 9, I think. Then the first thing is to try and get across that this is a culture, and that this culture defies even mainstream science. But it's a really tough message because the whole of academia at the moment, the reason they haven't found that national religiosity is a great pointer is because they're all biased towards the culture. That the whole of social science thinks that catastrophism is an output of the hard sciences. So my first goal will be, we got to realize, guys, this thing's a culture, and it's not just an opinion. We have proof that it's a culture. Deeper than that, I think it would be nice to have a discipline that has, knows how these things work, not just for climate catastrophism, but for all of them. So, at the moment, cultural evolution doesn't really deal with that. It doesn't deal with how they work at this moment in time. It deals with some of the things about how they've arisen, but it's a very complex and interdisciplinary subject. But it does not, for instance, go out and just say, measure a load of opinions, measure the culture. It just doesn't do that, because it doesn't understand that they're actually simple enough to measure. People like Dan Carhan, who are in social psychology, understand that, but he's not in cultural evolution. There's no place to say, hang on a minute, we can bring all this together and measure cultures, and then we can start to study them as entities, which we try then to stop them on getting the best out of them, like team spirit, but stopping the worst of them, like undermining the law, undermining democracy, and undermining science itself. Now, these are like hugely ambitious goals, clearly. And
but I mean, you have to aim for the stars, and and it is as you said, you have broken this ground now. It's a partly new field that other people can explore further.
Yes, exactly. The book is a beginning, not an end, and to get that beginning to as many people as possible is really where I guess my first goal would be.
So where can people find out more about you and your work, your book, and other stuff?
Well, I have for many years had posts on climate, etc. for like about 10 years. Judith Curry's fantastic blog, and she covers the social psychology and things like bias in science and those kind of angles, as well as the physical climate science. So a lot of stuff that led up to my book is there. I don't really have. I have a website that's pretty much defunct. I haven't done anything with it for some years. People can follow me on Twitter at Andy West _tweets, and I just tweet quite regularly on those kind of subjects. And of course, read the book. This is the main thing. Read the book.
Yes,
because it's a complete paradigm change. My editor Andrew Montford, in one of his very nice pieces that he wrote in my book, I think for the Daily Skeptic, he says there aren't many things come along that really change your mind about what the domain is about. And he obviously was deeply into the domain. He'd written the hockey stick illusion. He knew about the physical side of it very much, but he had not considered the motivation. Why is this happening? And why are people saying black is white and so on? And so I think it really changed his mind about what the domain is about. And I think that kind of change is what. But I don't have a lot about me. Anywhere.
Anyway, I'll put links to the book and to the other stuff that you mentioned here in the description box as usual.
Yeah.
And so, Andy, thanks again for joining the show, and good luck with your continued research in this field.
Fantastic. You great questions there, right to the heart of it. Thank you very much, Anders.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you.